So again, I'm Chris Monz. I'm from Utah State University up here in Logan, not down there in Salt Lake, with my University of Utah colleagues. And we're going to talk today a little bit about recreation ecology, which is the field, the specific discipline that I spend most of my time working in. So a little bit of our presentation overview for today. I'd like to start with some of the tried and true principles of recreation ecology. So we'll spend a little time looking at theories and generalizations and the implications of those that have been well established over about the last 30, 40 years of research in this field. We'll then drill it down to a little bit more specifically about what we know about ecosystems and issues relevant to Western Colorado. And then I want to wind up with some conclusions as to the best available knowledge and how we may implement those things in a broad sense from the standpoint of management of recreation. We're going to fly a little bit at, well, maybe not 30,000 feet today, but maybe something like 10,000 feet, and deal with, kind of a broad overview of the field and what we found in this particular review paper. And I look forward to entertaining any specific questions that you might have at the end of the discussion. All right, so first of all, a couple of definitions and kind of getting our heads around the field a little bit. Recreation ecology, I call myself a recreation ecologist. So I have broad training in both ecological science and social science relative to recreation. And I oftentimes work at the interface between those two. But a little more specifically, I just want to be clear that recreation ecology looks at recreation activities in wildland situations as an ecological disturbance agent in terms of it affecting soil, vegetation, wildlife, water, ecosystem components. That is not a value judgment on recreation. It's simply looking at it from the standpoint of it being a disturbance factor in changing wholesale or affecting ecosystem components. And so I'll use the term disturbance a lot today. Again, it's not a negative term. It's focused on the ecological aspects of disturbance. Recreation ecologists oftentimes also work on how the ecological conditions affect the visitor experience, and supporting a wildland visitor experience oftentimes involves the maintenance of a high degree of ecological integrity. So we oftentimes look at the human dimension and that human component quite a bit. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but if you have questions, we can certainly entertain them. Basically, contemporary thinking looks at our parks and protected areas, wilderness areas, national forest lands that are available for recreation as social ecological systems, that humans are a part of that system in terms of the activities that we pursue in those landscapes. And as such, we oftentimes look at managerial solutions to allow for human benefits and then protect ecological conditions. So going a little bit back to kind of the origins of a lot of the thinking in recreation ecology, I oftentimes use this figure, and this goes way back to work that was done in the 70s and 80s, but is still very relevant today. And so I want to spend a few minutes here and look at this. And can you all see my cursor on the screen? Can you guys see the cursor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. So let's spend a minute here and talk about what I call use disturbance theory. We look on the vertical axis. We're looking at kind of a hypothetical increase in disturbance, ecological disturbance on the landscape. And this could be something like vegetation damage. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. on the horizontal axis, we're looking at increases in use. So what we're looking at here is a relationship between use and the resulting ecological disturbance. Many studies done with controlled experimental designs over the years have demonstrated this curvilinear response. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this in a minute, but for the time being, let's just look at this generalization. So there's a couple of things that come out of this overall use response function that we can more or less make some good conclusions about. The first one is that initial use on this part of the graph results in a very rapid change, a very rapid increase in the amount of disturbance. Once that disturbance has been created, if we wind up using the same finite space, additional use can increase significantly with very little change in overall observable disturbance. And so this generalization has really informed a lot of management over the years, and we'll go into some detail in a minute about what that looks like. Again, this has largely been based on experimental studies done over the years. There are some refinements to this that we'll talk about in a minute, but in general, this is a useful generalization to think about the management and the implications of recreation use. Back in 2013, I worked with some international colleagues, and we looked back through this literature and looked across many experimental studies, and we published a paper in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, which is a very reputable journal. What we found is that this generalization more or less still holds true based on the many studies that we found. So this relatively simple figure here of increasing use dramatically, or increasing impact dramatically with the initial use, still more or less holds true, and it's useful. However, there's some refinements to that. And again, one of them is that some ecosystems show this kind of initial lag period and then rapid change, but we still kind of wind up in the same place. We'll talk about wildlife responses in a minute. Out of this, we came to several conclusions. First is that the generalization is still pretty useful. It may not be exact, but broadly, it helps us quite a bit in terms of recreation management. Secondly, that high use or intensive use requires some level of spatial confinement in order to minimize disturbance. And so that's this part of the figure here. If we have high use, probably best to try to confine it to places where disturbance has already been created. This idea of dispersal, that kind of only works in certain unique situations where you can really manage visitors and you can emphasize minimum impact practices. And again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. Important to note here, when I talk about dispersal, I don't mean at-large camping or unmanaged camping, and it oftentimes is used in that capacity. Dispersed use is really truly dispersal, where use is low, visitors are required to have a minimum presence in a given area and are required to use durable surfaces for their camping and travel. And again, we can talk more about that if you like. Okay, so taking this yet a step further into kind of management theory, what does this mean for us? Well, this is a little bit of a complicated figure, but let's spend a minute here and kind of walk through it. Again, we're looking at disturbance on the vertical axis, and we're looking at use level on the horizontal axis. We see our familiar figure here, okay? Use impact relationship, use disturbance relationship. And then we're looking at a couple of situations. If we're employing a dispersal strategy and we expect to minimize disturbance, we really have to be way down here on this figure in order for that to be effective. And that's largely a function of this steep response that we see occurring with small increases in initial use. Oftentimes, if we're in an unregulated or at-large situation, what happens is we get this through this period of disturbance, and then disturbance remains relatively high throughout the ecosystem. What also tends to happen is we tend to see multiple sites forming. So in a sense, these unregulated kind of situations with no guidance and no management for visitors oftentimes result in a proliferation of overall disturbance and impact. In the same light, if we engage a management action of some sort in order to try to minimize disturbance, and there are a whole range of things that have been employed and tested, we can get into a situation that we call spatial confinement. And in spatial confinement, on any one particular location, we may have a high degree of disturbance, but we've spatially confined it to less overall area. And as a consequence, this situation is often seen as very desirable from a management perspective. Okay, so a lot of information there. Again, we can kind of come back to this and dissect it a little bit, but that's how the overall field has progressed over the years through various research studies and management experiments. Putting this together in a bigger picture, so kind of ratcheting up a little bit, we oftentimes look conceptually at how recreation use can affect different components in the ecosystem. And so this is a little bit of a complicated figure, but let's drill it down a little bit for a minute to just kind of focus our thinking on the various aspects we'll talk about today. Well, first, there are elements in the recreation system, in the wildland system, that we can influence, that managers have some degree of influence. And so understanding these components and how they interact with the things we observe and measure in the field that we can see, like biotic disturbance, maybe it's altered physical environment, maybe it's invasive species. And these issues may vary depending on the situation that we're in. But understanding those relationships is important to us because by influencing some of these factors here of visitor use, we can potentially improve or affect these conditions. In the same light, these larger scale issues of changes, broad scale changes in the environment, changes in the biotic environment or the physical environment, such as changes in plant community or wildlife community dynamics, are the things we want to avoid, the larger scale ecological consequences. So we oftentimes in recreation ecology operate at the nexus between all of these factors in an effort to try to maintain sustainable use for these larger scale issues over the long run. Okay, so that's some broad theories, some broad conceptual ideas of the way we kind of think about recreation, social ecological systems, parks, protected lands, etc. Now let's talk a little bit about some specifics when it comes to how recreation affects different ecosystem components. So there's obviously a lot of factors. It's oftentimes very difficult in observational studies to control for them. But what I'll present to you here are largely the result of experimental studies. I may add that a lot of this information here is presented in detail in the review paper Will mentioned earlier in our discussion. Okay, so first, let's talk about how the environment might affect the different kinds of responses we might see in the field. So I did a study a number of years ago now with David Cole at the Forest Service, where we examined two different ecosystem types with the same level of disturbance that was applied to them in an experimental design. And this was part of larger studies where we were examining many different aspects of recreation effects on soils and plants. But the point I want to make here is comparing two different environment types in relatively the same geographic location. Here, a subalpine meadow compared to a forest understory with the same level of recreation disturbance applied across these two different environments resulted in vastly different effects. And so as a consequence, we were able to identify very fragile forest understory environments and produce some good recommendations for minimum impact camping in those locations. In the same light, things like a soil loss have been investigated quite well. Some work that Tom DeLuca did back in the 90s at Montana State illustrate how different activity types can affect soil loss. And so this was controlled experimental design work where they applied different levels of disturbance created by hikers, llamas, and horses compared to control conditions. And as we can see here, these resulted in different levels of soil loss. So we oftentimes investigate things, they're very situational. There's behavioral related components and environment related components, as you can see. But the point of the matter is there are differences in environment type and in activity type. When it comes to wildlife, these similar kinds of issues have been examined as well. And so back in our 2013 paper and some work that Rick Knight from Colorado State and Kevin Gutzweiler from Baylor University did back in the 90s suggests that wildlife might respond very differently to the kinds of increases in use that we just examined with the use disturbance curve from soils and vegetation. And there could be a couple of different models here, but one of the models that has come out of the literature is this flight or fight kind of disturbance model. And that is that wildlife might tolerate a little bit of use to start with, but then they get displaced to other locations. And that's what this figure suggests. That displacement may or may not last. Many times we see wildlife returning at some level to those locations. At other times, we've seen a complete displacement from areas that have a high degree of recreation activity. This has been illustrated in this paper that was completed in 2018, and again is cited in the review paper. Some work that examined elk movement based on different activity types. And so the idea is compared to control conditions, which is the orange, looking at applied treatments and experimental design of different kinds of activities common in our wildland areas: motorized use or ATV, mountain biking, hiking, and horse use. And as we can see here from the standpoint of this disturbance measure that is moving from the trail, there are different responses based on these different activity types. And so there's some examples of things. Again, we're looking at elk movement here. Remember that when it comes to wildlife, the vast majority of wildlife taxa we really don't know a lot about. And so we oftentimes make generalizations based on some key species that we're interested in, but we may in fact be ignoring responses from other species that may be important. So always interpret some of these things with a degree of caution. Okay, so that's some overall stuff, some specific discussion on things that are in the paper. Let's talk a little bit more about what we found specifically that was relevant to our study area in Western Colorado, and then a little bit about what the best available science might suggest from the standpoint of management. Okay, so to take a step back a little bit here, Sam provided this great figure here of kind of the overall geographic scope of where we focused this work for the review. Many areas of the White River and other areas all in your neck of the woods. So I was very happy to continue to learn more about this geographic location. As many of you know, our whole area of the Intermountain and Rocky Mountain West has seen dramatic changes over the last decade or a little bit more in terms of visitor use of our public lands. And so as a consequence, we're seeing many different kinds of management issues and concerns emerge, some of which we may have thought about. Other things like COVID were very unexpected and resulted in some significant changes. There's lots of other things going on. We've seen rapid growth in our communities here in the Rocky Mountain and Intermountain West, and there are relationships between that community expansion and growth and visitation to our public lands, as the amenity of living near and proximate to public lands is clearly a draw for many folks. Changes in technology have emerged that are also resulting in big changes on the landscape. And we could talk about some of those if you'd like. The promotion of recreation and tourism and the recreation and tourism lifestyle, if you will, all has played a role in some of these dynamics. And there's been some ups and downs recently in terms of the amount of use in our parks and protected lands, but it sure does seem like these increases, at least at some level, are set to continue into the future. In terms of the key findings that we identified in the paper, in terms of the overall literature, we identified about a dozen studies that had direct applicability to the study area in Western Colorado. Now, some of these may not have been actually done within the bounds of that geographic area that I just showed you, but they were performed in locations close enough and similar enough that we felt like there was enough comparison that they had a lot of validity. I'll present these very briefly here, but again, we can certainly go into more detail, and you'll find a lot of detail on this in the paper. So first of all, soil and vegetation disturbance was conducted in a very foundational way in Colorado and in nearby areas that are very applicable to the study site. One study that I will mention here is Dave Cole's study back in 1993, which was very important in terms of advancing this knowledge of use and disturbance for vegetation. Much of it was conducted in the Rocky Mountain region, and a lot of the generalizations that came out of that study applied to ecosystems in the study area. And so that was very important. We also found that there were a significant number of studies on wildlife. Some good work has been done on elk, some of which I just shared with you. That was not done in the study area, but was done in a similar enough capacity that we felt like results were relevant. There's been some work done on lynx habitat, which was very important. And a lot of work has been done on ground nesting bird species, especially the work of Rick Knight at Colorado State, which was very informative. Okay, so putting all this together in kind of a summary, what did we learn from specifically some of this? Again, Dave Cole's work on vegetation was very important in identifying the idea that the forest understory is one of our more fragile environments that needs to be incorporated into minimum impact camping and management strategies. Another important finding that came out of this work was that study on lynx, very important work there, advancing the idea of looking at resource utilization from both the standpoint of winter recreationists and lynx winter habitat. And what they found there is minimal overlap between the two, which was very important from the standpoint of understanding the disturbance at that stage, or potential disturbance to lynx in the winter. The elk work that I mentioned, it illustrated some of the issues with different activity types. and all trails were avoided to a certain degree with all activity types. But as we noted, some things caused a bit more observable disturbance to elk than others, and that's an important consideration. Last, an important finding from all of this emphasized the sensitivity of nesting bird species. Again, I would point to the work of Rick Knight and his students done over many years in different environments, and how nesting bird species, in particular threatened and endangered bird species, we need to be very concerned about because they're very sensitive during those times of year to a human presence of all different kinds of activity types. Okay, so those were some key findings, and I guess that would be the what, and now we can look at it as the so what. What does this mean to us? Again, keep in mind, for a lot of species, we don't have any information. And so our best approaches really probably involve a precautionary principle type of approach. But again, we want to provide the benefits and allow for recreation use. So what guidance might this suggest? Again, there's more detail in the paper, so I want to present two overall figures. We'll spend a little time on these and kind of drill this down, but I'm sure we'll come back and discuss specific questions that you might have. First of all, spending a minute here, what might be some management strategies that we would look at? As we talked about earlier.
Just so you know, folks in the room probably can't read the text on that, so just walk us through what it says.
Okay, it's quite big on my screen here, so apologies for that. What might some wildland management strategies be? Well, we could be unregulated. We could do a dispersal strategy. We could do a confinement strategy in two forms. It could be informal, or it could be formal, in this case of requiring visitors to camp and travel in designated locations. If we go through this, what likely are the outcomes of this situation? Well, as we saw earlier, in an unregulated situation, if we're particularly applying that at a high degree of recreation intensity, it's likely to be pretty ineffective. And that's because of this use response function that we looked at earlier. It's only going to be effective in very specific situations where we have a high degree of regulation of visitor activities and a high degree of compliance in minimum impact types of behaviors. Well, we could look at a dispersal strategy. And again, we're kind of in the same situation. We can ask visitors to camp and travel on previously undisturbed or previously disturbed surfaces, but disturbing or distributing use across undisturbed areas is likely to be very ineffective. Well, that leads us down the road of a confinement strategy. And confinement can take two different forms. One could be, well, let's ask visitors to use the best minimum impact strategies. That's an advantage because it allows for visitor freedom, and it's likely to be effective if visitors comply. In very high use situations, confinement strategies where trails and sites are designated and visitors are required to use them has been demonstrated largely to be the most effective situation in the long run. Of course, we have to deal with capacity issues there and overflow and all of these kinds of things. But in a general approach, those things are likely to be the most effective. Another way to look at this would be through the lens of wildlife. And so what we did in the paper is tried to drill down what might the issues be and how might we address those for wildlife. And so on this column, I have the issues and concerns. And in this column here, I have the likely effectiveness of those. And so in a situation where we're dealing with on-trail use in non-motorized settings, well, we might be very concerned about birds and ungulates in these kinds of situations. Those things have been investigated. What are the issues that the literature suggests? Well, there's probably going to be a fair bit of concern during nesting and breeding periods. And so as a consequence, that suggests certain kinds of management strategies, particularly during those times. And as I mentioned previously, the idea that these nesting and breeding periods are very sensitive times is very important. So in some cases, site closure has been used quite effectively, or rerouting trails to minimize disturbance during those times. Well, we might be concerned about motorized or mechanized types of disturbances, and some studies have shown that there's more disturbance in motorized and mechanized situations. Others have shown somewhat less disturbance. So once again, we're seeing it very situational. The elk disturbance that we looked at earlier suggests there might be more disturbance. Again, other studies have shown somewhat less. So what do we do here? Well, again, confining use to known and established travel routes is probably going to be the most effective. It allows wildlife the opportunity to adapt to that use and that situation in a predictable way. Again, as we mentioned earlier, recreation use in proximity to nesting sites. All bird species are particularly sensitive, as near as we can tell from the literature. And again, what would be an effective situation here? There's been a history of applying site and route closures in these situations that have been pretty effective. And that's particularly the case when we're dealing with endangered or rare species. And so that's probably going to be the precautionary approach in this situation. Probably one of the biggest overall issues is this idea of expansion into new areas that potentially harbor wildlife and are important habitat. And it's difficult to generalize this response because of so many variables. But having said that, precautionary approach would suggest minimizing the additional habitat impact through fragmentation, reductions in patch size, is probably one of our most important concerns when it comes to wildlife. Many of you have probably followed the wolverine story. We now see that wolverines are now on the endangered species list, and that suggests potential issues with management for that habitat with niche overlap with winter recreationists. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be thinking about in a proactive way, and thinking about innovative strategies for managing humans on the landscape. I also might throw in a little bit of speculation, and that is some of the work that we've been doing in other environments suggests that visitors, through our survey research, are responding quite differently than they have historically in wildland settings. So what I wanted to point out here, just very basically, are some assessments we've done recently out in California, looking at different motivations that visitors have for engaging in outdoor recreation, natural area type activities. And what we're starting to see is more of an emphasis on things like visiting with friends and family while they're out, and outdoor exercise, and less of a emphasis on what we might consider more traditional solitude-based kind of approaches. So as a consequence, it suggests maybe that visitors might start to understand some of these confinement and regulatory things a little bit more in the context of providing for outdoor recreation activities, because their motivations are changing slightly. Now, I'm speculating here, but I think it's encouraging to think that we have opportunities with changes in the visiting public to engage in some different kinds of management strategies. Okay, so wrapping all of this up today, I think there's some overall conclusions that we can come to from the work. First of all, we're really only dealing with a dozen or so studies that are directly applicable to Western Colorado, but the field is robust, and there's a lot of information that can be brought to bear from the standpoint of these general principles. And so as a consequence, we can infer a lot, and that gives us some direction in terms of developing overall management strategies. The second conclusion, I think the literature is pretty conclusive here, is that dispersal strategies are likely to increase overall ecological disturbance. And we've looked at that from a couple of different dimensions today, and let it suffice to say that there's a lot of literature to support that. In the same light, this idea of confinement to established areas where disturbance has already been formed on the landscape reduces overall disturbance. In terms of wildlife, the nesting, breeding, species-specific responses are very clear. And so these are kinds of variables we need to think about and that we need to be concerned with when it comes to overall recreation management. There are many opportunities for coexistence. And so as a consequence, there's some good management strategies out there. One of the biggest things that I think we need to be concerned about with these increases in use is not necessarily increases at established sites, but expansion into new locations with new activities. These types of situations have the potential to result in fragmentation, increases in disturbance, and as a consequence, overall concerns when it comes to managing the integrity of wildlands. Okay, so that's what I have for you today, and be happy to entertain any questions.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,